The day was thick with dust and the promise of a coming storm, a heavy, oppressive air that clung to the skin. I was setting up my camera on a makeshift tripod of crates, adjusting the focus on the general store across the street. My aim was to capture a slice of life in our burgeoning town of Cedar Creek, a simple moment in time before progress and pavement erased the wooden sidewalks and the horse-drawn carriages. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the boardwalk, a tall gentleman with a fine suit and a neat bowler hat, his back to the storefront. I knew him, of course. Everyone in town knew Arthur Finch. He was a successful lawyer, sharp and reclusive, with a reputation for intense, solitary thought. He often walked alone, lost in a world only he seemed to inhabit. This day was no different. He stood there, one hand resting on the polished handle of his walking stick, the other gesturing as if mid-sentence. He was speaking, his lips moving soundlessly from my vantage point, his head slightly tilted as if listening to a response. I was about to dismiss the shot as uninteresting when I saw a flicker of something in my peripheral vision, just on the edge of the frame. It was a movement, a shape, that seemed to materialize from the haze of the afternoon light. It was another man. He was dressed similarly to Finch, a dark suit and a bowler, and he was facing him directly. His posture was so natural, so perfectly aligned with Finch's gesture, that my mind registered them as two men in conversation. I quickly adjusted my focus and snapped the shutter, the click of the camera a sharp punctuation in the quiet afternoon. When the plate was developed later that evening in the darkroom, the reality of the image hit me with a chill. There, on the grainy monochrome plate, was not just Arthur Finch but another man, an entire, distinct figure who I was certain, with every fiber of my being, had not been there. His face was a blur, a slight smudge, but his form was clear. His hand was raised, his head tilted, the exact mirror of Finch's posture. He was speaking, just as Finch was. I stared at the photo, the smell of the chemicals filling the room, and a cold dread settled in my stomach. The two men were conversing, but only one of them had been present for the picture. The other was a ghost on the plate, a visitor from nowhere. I knew, in that moment, that this was not just a simple photograph. It was a secret caught in time. The gentleman to the left of the photograph, the one who was undeniably there, was Arthur Finch. He was a man of impeccable habits and meticulous dress. A lawyer by trade, he had built a respectable practice from the ground up, handling property disputes and the occasional inheritance case with a cool, detached efficiency. He was a pillar of the community, or at least, that's what the town's gossips would say. In truth, Arthur Finch was a fortress of a man. His home was always shuttered, his face a mask of polite indifference, and his interactions with others brief and to the point. He was never rude, but he was never warm. He lived alone, his wife having passed away years prior, and his social life consisted of an occasional game of chess at the club. The town of Cedar Creek had long since gotten used to his eccentricities. They would see him walking down the street, his polished walking stick tapping a steady rhythm on the boardwalk, a low murmur on his lips. People would often assume he was practicing a legal argument or rehearsing a speech. But those who had listened closer, those who lingered in the shadows of doorways or watched from behind lace curtains, knew differently. They spoke of how he would turn his head as if responding to a question, how his hand would gesture in a silent debate, and how his expression would shift from a frown of contemplation to a look of utter, rapt attention. I had always dismissed it as a quirk of an isolated man. After all, a sharp mind needs something to chew on, even in solitude. It was only after developing the photograph that a new, terrifying possibility presented itself. Had Arthur Finch not been talking to himself all this time? Had he been conversing with someone, or something, invisible to the rest of us? Looking at the photo now, his posture seems different, more purposeful. His hand is not just gesturing, it seems to be in the middle of an argument, a firm rebuttal to a point just made. The set of his jaw, the furrow in his brow, it's the expression of a man deeply engaged in a conversation, not just a quiet rumination. The presence of the other figure, even in its spectral form, gives context to every one of his gestures. It transforms a lonely, introspective man into one half of a chilling and private dialogue. It makes you wonder how long this conversation had been going on, and what secrets were being exchanged on the quiet, dusty streets of Cedar Creek. The true unsettling nature of the photograph lay not with Arthur Finch, but with his silent companion. The figure on the right, which I had only seen as a blur in my peripheral vision, was strikingly, hauntingly present on the developed plate. He was a man, undeniably, with a distinct form and silhouette. He wore a suit, its fabric and cut a perfect match for the era, and a bowler hat sat squarely on his head. He was holding a walking stick, just like Finch, and his hand was raised in a gesture that seemed to emphasize a point in their shared, unspoken conversation. Yet, a closer inspection revealed a chilling absence of detail. The face was a smudge, a vacant oval where features should have been. The fabric of his suit had no texture, no creases, as if it were a flat, two-dimensional drawing. The walking stick he held was nothing but a line, without the gleam of polished wood. He was a perfect imitation of a man, lacking only the substance. His form was a contradiction, solid enough to be captured by the camera's sensitive chemicals, but hollow enough to be invisible to the naked eye. This was the source of my dread. It wasn't a double exposure, a common error that I, a seasoned photographer, would have recognized instantly. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a person who was not a person. Looking from Finch to the shadow, a terrible symmetry emerged. They were two halves of a whole, a yin and yang of presence and absence. Finch's hand, a solid, tangible thing, seemed to be responding to the shadow's immaterial gesture. The expression on Finch's face, that look of intense engagement, was no longer a sign of madness, but a reaction to an actual presence. The photograph became a window into a private world, a world where the laws of reality were bent and a conversation with the unseen was possible. I stared at the ghostly figure, its form a perfect blend of recognition and impossibility, and I felt a tremor of fear. It wasn't the fear of a ghost story, but the cold, rational fear of something that defied explanation. What kind of being could cast a photographic shadow without casting a human one? What was this entity that walked among us, visible only to a few and to the unblinking eye of a camera lens? The silence of the figure in the photo was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It screamed of secrets and a truth far stranger than anything I could imagine. I couldn't keep the photograph to myself. The unsettling image of Arthur Finch and his silent companion was a weight on my conscience. It was a secret, but it felt like a dangerous one, a piece of evidence that pointed to something beyond my understanding. The first person I showed it to was old Mr. Abernathy, the town's chronicler and a man who believed every rumor he heard, which, to be fair, was most of them. He peered at the photo through his spectacles, his eyes widening as he took in the impossible sight. He was the first to give voice to the unspoken terror. "A spirit," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "A man who walks with a ghost." I always knew there was something strange about Finch. The news spread like a prairie fire. First, it was the men at the general store, then the ladies at the market, and soon the entire town of Cedar Creek was buzzing. People would stop me on the street, asking to see the ghost picture. I'd show them the plate, and their reactions were always the same, a mix of morbid fascination and genuine fear. Skeptics, of course, were quick to offer logical explanations. Young Thomas, the clerk at the hardware store, insisted it was a double exposure, a simple mistake on my part. A few others suggested it was a trick of the light, a reflection from a window, or some strange property of the new photographic plates. But they all fell silent when I explained my process, the controlled conditions of my darkroom, and the fact that I had only taken one picture that afternoon. The image was a single, undeniable capture of a moment in time, a moment that didn't make sense. The photograph became a legend in Cedar Creek. It was no longer just a picture. It was the ghost of Mr. Finch, or the gentleman and his demon. People started to talk about Arthur Finch differently. His quiet demeanor was no longer seen as a quirk, but as proof of his communion with the unseen. The whispers followed him everywhere. He seemed oblivious to it all, though. He would walk down the street, his back straight, his eyes fixed on some distant point, his lips moving in that silent conversation. We, the townspeople, would watch him, and in our minds, we could now see the other half of his dialogue, the empty space beside him filled by the haunting figure from my photograph. The image hadn't just captured a mystery, it had created one, forever changing how we saw the man in the bowler hat. The photograph and the ensuing rumors had me obsessed. I knew that the key to understanding the figure in the photo was to find some kind of tangible proof of his existence. I began my search in the town hall, poring over old ledgers, property records, and census documents from the preceding years. I was looking for anything that might match the description of the man in the dark suit. I went through records of new arrivals to Cedar Creek, hoping to find a family that had recently settled in town, or a traveling salesman who had passed through and vanished. My efforts were in vain. The man from the photograph didn't exist in any official capacity. There were no records of his birth, no mention of his name in any deed, and no family that matched his description. It was as if he had simply materialized on the streets of Cedar Creek for one brief, unsettling moment. The more I searched, the more the logical explanations began to crumble around me. It wasn't a traveler, a drifter, or a new resident, it was a blank space in the town's history. I moved my search to the local newspaper archives, looking for any mention of a disappearance or an unexplained event that might coincide with the day the photograph was taken. The headlines spoke of crop yields, town council meetings, and the occasional minor theft. There were no missing persons reports, no mysterious incidents, nothing that could account for the presence of a man who was there and not there. The lack of evidence was, in itself, a form of evidence. It solidified the terrifying truth of the photograph. This was not a forgotten face from the past. This was a figure that defied the very fabric of our reality. The more I failed to find him in the written history of our town, the more he became a part of its ghostly folklore. He was a man who left no footprints, who had no story, and who existed only on a single unsettling photographic plate. He was an anomaly, an error in the grand tapestry of life in Cedar Creek, and his very non-existence made his presence in the photo all the more chilling. The photograph was a puzzle, and my search for an outside explanation had yielded nothing. The answer, I realized, had to lie with the man himself, Arthur Finch. The opportunity to learn more came a week after the photo's public debut, when I was hired by the Finch family's solicitor, a Mr. Davies, to take some pictures of their estate. Arthur Finch, it turned out, was planning a trip, a long and indefinite journey, and he wanted photographs taken for posterity. Mr. Davies was a kind, unassuming man, and as we went about our work, he spoke with a troubled sigh about Arthur's growing reclusiveness. "He's always been a solitary fellow," Mr. Davies said, "but lately, he's been living in his own world entirely." It was then, as we sorted through some documents in the study, that I saw it on the corner of his desk. A leather-bound journal, its pages worn and well thumbed. A name was etched in gold on the cover: Arthur P. Finch. I was not a man to pry, but my journalistic curiosity and the lingering mystery of the photograph were too strong to resist. When Mr. Davies was distracted, I quickly flipped through the pages. The handwriting was neat, precise, and filled with the lawyerly details one would expect from a man like Finch. But nestled between legal notes and financial figures were entries of a different nature entirely. They were not for an audience, they were deeply personal and, frankly, insane. The entries didn't mention the man in the photograph directly, but they spoke of him. Arthur referred to him as my companion, or the advisor. The entries described their conversations, the arguments they had, and the plans they made. June 12, 1888. The companion suggested a new investment in railroad bonds. His counsel is always sound, though his arguments can be tedious. Another entry read, June 20, 1888, a difference of opinion on the O'Connell case. He sees a flaw in the prosecution's argument I had not considered. A brilliant mind, but impatient. My hands trembled as I read. This wasn't the rambling of a madman. It was a clear, lucid account of a man in conversation with a being that did not exist. The journal was the proof I had been searching for, but it only deepened the mystery. The photograph had captured a conversation, and the journal proved that it was real to Arthur Finch. But what was it that Finch was talking to? An imaginary friend? A ghost? Or something far, far stranger? I closed the journal and replaced it just as Mr. Davies returned. I had my answer, but the simple truth of it was more terrifying than any ghost story. Arthur Finch wasn't a victim of a haunting. He was a willing participant in a chilling dialogue with an invisible entity. The journal entries provided the how, but not the why. I wanted to know when this strange partnership began, and Arthur Finch's own words, buried in an earlier section of his journal, finally gave me a clue. The entry was dated May 1888, a little over a month before the photograph was taken. It described a specific evening, an unusual break in his otherwise rigid routine. May 5, 1888, a late evening at the law office. The rain was coming down in sheets, a terrible, lonely sound. I had just finished the Gentry will, a truly tedious affair, and was preparing to lock up. I admit I was tired and a bit melancholy. It was then that I heard the tapping. A sharp, insistent rap on the glass of my office window. I looked up, expecting to see a branch or perhaps a lost soul seeking shelter. There was no one there. Yet the tapping continued, a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was a pattern, almost a code. I opened the window to silence it, and that's when I heard the voice. It wasn't a sound in the traditional sense, but more like a thought in my own head. A perfect, clear voice that knew my name. "Good evening, Mr. Finch. You look as though you could use a friend." I confess, I was terrified. I slammed the window shut, locked the door, and spent the night cowering in my own home, trying to convince myself I had imagined it all. But he hadn't imagined it. The journal went on to describe how the voice returned the next day, and the day after that. It was always there, a constant companion that only Arthur could hear. It spoke of his past, his professional life, and personal regrets, with an uncanny knowledge that shattered his skepticism. He tried to ignore it, to drown it out with work and noise, but it was relentless. Finally, he gave in, a desperate act of surrender. He began to respond, speaking aloud to the thoughts in his head, and found that the voice replied in turn. The entry for May 20th was a final, chilling acceptance of his new reality. I no longer fear it. I embrace it. The voice, my companion, is a font of knowledge. It sees things I cannot, knows things I have no right to know. I find myself listening more than speaking. I am not mad. I am enlightened. This was the answer I had sought. It wasn't a sudden, ghostly appearance, but a slow, insidious possession. The photograph had not captured the beginning of the relationship, but a moment when it had grown so strong, so entrenched, that it was beginning to manifest itself in the physical world. The figure wasn't a random specter, but a reflection of a relationship that had consumed a man's mind, a relationship so real to him that it was finally, for one terrifying moment, real to my camera as well. The journal was a chilling account of a man's descent into a shared reality, but it didn't fully explain the nature of his companion. The truth was hidden in a cryptic entry from late May, tucked away in the back of the journal. Arthur wrote about a deep sense of guilt, a forgotten debt that had come due. He speaks of the past, of a family I barely remember, of a name lost to time. He says I owe him, that my prosperity is built on a foundation of his unfulfilled dreams. The companion, Arthur wrote, was a forgotten ancestor, a great-great-uncle who had died young and penniless, his ambitions shattered by bad luck and a devious business partner. His name was Alastair Finch. He had been a visionary, an inventor with grand plans to harness the new power of electricity. But his partner had stolen his patents, his money, and his life's work, leaving him to die in obscurity. Alastair's ghost, or whatever he was, had been tethered to the family line, a restless spirit unable to move on, waiting for a descendant worthy of his knowledge and his vengeance. Arthur was that descendant. The companion's voice, which had first seemed like a random apparition, was a manifestation of a long-dormant family curse. The pact was not something Arthur had made, but a debt he had inherited. Alastair's spirit offered to guide him, to grant him the success and prosperity that had been stolen from him in life. The price? Arthur had to be his vessel, to act on his counsel, to carry out his legacy, and to finally right the historical wrong. The bargain was tempting. Alastair, the advisor, was brilliant. His insights into business and law were unparalleled, offering Arthur an almost supernatural edge in his practice. He knew the hidden flaws in contracts, the secret motives of his opponents, and the perfect moment to strike. Arthur, consumed by his own ambition and tired of his solitary life, had agreed. The journal became a testament to his rising star, each success attributed to the quiet, unseen influence of his companion. But as his fortunes grew, so did his dependence. The initial terror was replaced by a kind of symbiotic relationship, a chilling pact sealed in the silence of his mind. He was no longer just Arthur Finch, the lawyer. He was the vessel for a forgotten ghost, a man possessed by the past, a chilling fact that my photograph had captured for all to see. Arthur Finch's journal became my window into a world of impossible knowledge. The companion, Alastair Finch, was not just a guiding voice for Arthur's career. He was a conduit to the past, a library of forgotten secrets. The entries were filled with revelations about the town of Cedar Creek that no living person could possibly know. June 3, 1888, the companion revealed the location of a buried strongbox beneath the old gentry barn. A hidden will, long thought lost, was inside. He saw it hidden there on his own deathbed, a bitter irony. June 15, 1888, we spoke of the O'Malley land dispute. He told me the old Irishman was not the rightful owner. His father had won the land in a crooked poker game, using marked cards. The companion told me where the cards were hidden, in a loose floorboard beneath the O'Malley's bed. The secrets were not just about money or property, they were intimate and personal. Arthur wrote of Alastair's memories, his bitterness toward the people who had wronged him, and his strange, unfulfilled love for a woman named Eleanor. The companion's voice, which only Arthur could hear, was filled with a mix of wisdom and a deep, festering resentment. The most disturbing revelation came in an entry from early July. The companion speaks of his foe, the man who stole his life's work. A lawyer named Harrington, a man who built a fortune on stolen patents. The companion says he's not resting, that his spirit is tied to this town until he can see his revenge carried out. He says Harrington's descendants still live here, in the grand manor on the hill. He wants me to expose them, to destroy their name and reputation. The conversations with Alastair were no longer just about gaining a professional edge. They had become a twisted form of therapy, a long, whispered session of a bitter ghost recounting the grievances of his long-dead life. Arthur was caught in the middle, a living man forced to act as a silent confidant to a vengeful spirit. The photograph I had taken was not just a glimpse of a strange conversation, but a testament to the chilling and parasitic relationship between a man and his ancestor. The murmuring I had heard that day on the boardwalk wasn't just idle talk. It was the transference of a century-old grudge, a secret that was about to change Arthur Finch's life forever. With the secrets and ancient knowledge came a profound change in Arthur Finch's life. The once solitary and reserved lawyer began to make bold, decisive moves. He bought up vast swathes of land on the town's outskirts, seemingly at random, only to have a new railroad line announced a month later, bisecting his property and turning it into a gold mine. He won a seemingly unwinnable legal case against the powerful lumber barons, armed with a centuries-old document that his companion had directed him to find in a forgotten church library. His influence in Cedar Creek grew exponentially. People who had once dismissed him as eccentric now came to him for advice, marveling at his uncanny foresight. But as his public star rose, his personal life became a hollow shell. His conversations with others became short and distracted, his mind always listening for the murmur of Alastair's voice. He would be in the middle of a business meeting, his eyes glazing over as he received a whispered instruction from his ancestor. He was no longer a man of his own thoughts, he was a puppet on invisible strings. The journal entries began to reflect a growing unease. July 10, 1888. The companion is growing more demanding. He requires more of my time, more of my attention. He spoke of the Harrington family again, with a venom that chilled me. He does not just want their ruin, he wants their public humiliation. It feels unseemly. The advice was no longer about mutual success. It was about revenge. Alastair's whispers were twisting Arthur's ambition into a dark, malicious force. The walking stick he carried, the one that seemed to act as a kind of physical anchor for his conversations, was now a constant presence, his hand clutching it even when indoors. It was no longer a symbol of gentlemanly grace. It was a crutch, a connection to the parasitic entity that was slowly consuming his life. Arthur Finch was a man who had sold his soul not to a devil, but to a ghost, and the price was his very sanity and freedom. He was now a stranger in his own life, a vessel for a bitter, unforgiving past. Arthur's friends and colleagues could no longer ignore the changes in him. His once meticulous appearance became disheveled, his suits wrinkled, his hair unkempt. He would often be seen muttering to himself in the streets, a habit that now carried an air of desperation rather than quiet contemplation. A colleague, an older lawyer named Miller, once tried to approach him. "Arthur, are you well? You seem distracted." Arthur simply stared at him, his eyes distant and unseeing, before walking away mid-sentence, his lips moving in a silent reply to a voice only he could hear. The town, which had once been in awe of his successes, now started to pity him, and then to fear him. Children would point and whisper as he passed. Business associates grew uncomfortable, as his decisions became increasingly erratic and fueled by a strange, vindictive malice that seemed to come from nowhere. He would withdraw from conversations, turning his head as if listening to an inner voice, and then propose a sudden, aggressive legal strategy that had no basis in logic. His isolation was now complete. He no longer attended the chess club or the occasional town gathering. His world had shrunk to his home, his office, and the invisible companion who shadowed his every move. The journal entries grew more feverish, the elegant script becoming a scrawl. August 15, 1888. The companion is angry. He says I am weak, that I am not following his plans with enough conviction. He wants me to confront Harrington's grandson, to ruin his name publicly. He says it must be done, that his spirit cannot rest until it is. The photograph, which I had taken as a simple moment in time, had captured a man at a turning point. He wasn't just talking to a ghost, he was being consumed by one. The polite, reclusive lawyer was fading away, replaced by a hollow-eyed puppet, a man driven by the resentments and hatreds of a century-old ghost. The strange dialogue I had captured on the street was not a partnership but a slow, complete takeover of a man's life. The walking stick was more than a mere accessory, it was the key to their connection. Arthur had inherited the polished, silver-handled cane from a distant relative, a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations. He'd never thought much of it, until the day the tapping on his window began. The journal entries, particularly the later ones, revealed its true significance. August 20, 1888. The companion's presence is stronger when I hold the cane. It feels alive. He says it was his, that it holds a part of him, a tether to this world. Without it, the voice is faint, a distant echo. Alastair, it turned out, had commissioned the cane himself, its silver handle etched with a small, discreet symbol, a coiled snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. It was a symbol of his secret society, a group of scientists and inventors who dabbled in forbidden knowledge, believing they could blur the lines between life and death. Alastair's final desperate act was not an invention, but an attempt to bind his spirit to a physical object, a way to cheat death and continue his work. The cane was that object. It was a conduit, a spiritual lightning rod that allowed Alastair's restless soul to latch onto a living vessel, the first Finch to inherit it, which happened to be Arthur. The photograph I had taken showed Arthur holding the cane, and the companion's form, a physical manifestation of a spiritual connection, was perfectly aligned with it. It was a chilling confirmation that the cane was not just a prop, but a tool of possession. This revelation put everything into a terrifying new light. The conversations, the knowledge, the growing vindictiveness. It was all channeled through this seemingly innocuous object. It wasn't a curse that had found Arthur, it was a curse he had willingly picked up. The walking stick wasn't a mere symbol of his eccentricity, it was the instrument of his undoing, a link to a past that was not content to stay dead. He was not just a man talking to a ghost, he was a prisoner of a cursed artifact, a living battery for a vengeful spirit. The final, chilling entry in Arthur Finch's journal was dated the day after I took the photograph. September 1st, 1888. The companion has revealed his last wish. It is not for revenge, but for escape. He says he cannot rest, not here. He requires a new body, a new vessel, and a journey to a place where he can finally find peace. He has shown me the way, a place far from this town, a place I must go. The voice is stronger now than ever, a whisper in my ear telling me to leave everything behind. I am no longer in control. The next day, Arthur Finch vanished. His home was found locked and undisturbed. His papers were neatly organized, his business affairs in perfect order, and a single note was left on his desk from Mr. Davies. It read, in his neat, familiar handwriting, "I am going on a journey. Do not look for me. I am finally free." The town was thrown into chaos. A search party was organized, but they found no trace of him. It was as if he had simply stepped off the face of the earth. His walking stick was gone, of course, the very thing that had bound him to this world and was now leading him out of it. The police theorized he had simply left town, perhaps succumbing to a sudden illness or a mental breakdown. But I, and those who had seen the photograph and heard the rumors, knew better. The photograph, which had once been a curiosity, was now seen as a premonition, a final piece of evidence of the chilling relationship between a man and a ghost. The figure on the plate was no longer just a shadow, it was the final destination, the end of the line for Arthur Finch. He hadn't run away, he had followed his companion, a century-old debt finally settled, taking his own existence with him. The town of Cedar Creek was left with a mystery, a photograph, and a strange, unsettling feeling that something had walked among them that they could not see. The photograph became more than a local curiosity, it became a testament to the unknown. As the years passed and Arthur Finch's disappearance remained unsolved, the image was reproduced in newspapers and magazines, first locally, then across the country. It was a perfect, unsettling ghost story for the new century. The photo was studied by scholars, debunked by magicians, and held up as proof by spiritualists. It was no longer just a picture of two men on a boardwalk. It was the invisible man of Cedar Creek, the ghost of the Gentry will, and Arthur Finch's final conversation. The grainy black and white plate, which I still kept in my safe, became an object of legend. It was a chilling reminder that the world was not as simple or as rational as we believed it to be. The figure on the right, that immaterial shadow, had no story, no history, but he had left an indelible mark on the town's folklore and on the wider world's imagination. The town itself was never quite the same. The Finch house stood empty and silent for years, a monument to a mystery no one could solve. People would walk past it, whispering about the ghost that still might be inside. The street where the photograph was taken became a spot of morbid fascination for tourists. The image had branded the town with an unsettling notoriety, a place where a man had simply ceased to be. The photograph, a simple snap of a moment in time, had captured a truth that was beyond our comprehension. It wasn't just a man talking to himself. It was a man in conversation with a century-old curse, a transaction between the living and the dead. The image was the proof, the silent witness to a pact that had been paid in full with Arthur Finch's very existence. The story of Arthur Finch ends not with a conclusion, but with a lingering question. The photograph, now an enduring piece of folklore, serves as a permanent testament to the mystery. We know what happened. A man was consumed by a past he couldn't see, a promise he was forced to keep. But the why remains elusive. What was the true nature of the companion? Was he a ghost, a spirit of a long-dead ancestor, bound to the earth by an unfulfilled quest for justice? Or was he something else entirely, a malevolent entity that had simply used Alistair's name as a convenient disguise, preying on a solitary and vulnerable man? And what of Arthur Finch? His final journal entry spoke of a journey, a search for peace, for his companion. Did he find it? Did he truly lead the spirit to a new vessel, or did he simply become a part of the darkness he had so willingly embraced? Did he, and the cane that bound him, become a new legend, a whisper in some distant town, waiting for the next person to pick up the cursed artifact? The streets of Cedar Creek eventually became paved, the wooden boardwalks replaced by concrete. The horse-drawn carriages gave way to automobiles. But for those who knew the story, a walk down that old street would always feel different. They would always look to the empty space beside them, wondering if a conversation was taking place, a secret being shared that they were not meant to hear. The photograph remains, a silent, chilling monument to a conversation that was never meant to be captured, and a man who disappeared into a legacy that was not his own. The real horror of the story is not in what we know, but in what we don't.